We do have Wes Reynolds on the line for us to join us here for our Wednesday wagering segment. Wes, how's it going today, man?
Hey, Adam. Good morning. How are you?
Doing well, buddy. How you doing? How'd you enjoy that? How'd you enjoy working on Christmas?
Oh, it was interesting. I mean, it wasn't bad. I mean, that's just kind of part of the thing in this industry, or part of the thing in Las Vegas in general. I mean, things don't close. It's not conventional. So, I mean, there's a lot of people that are working on Christmas, and I mean, when you haven't really done it very often, you get an appreciation for the people that work on Christmas, whether it's in hospitality or whether it's in working in your local convenience stores or working in restaurants, you know, because it's not always easy, but once you do it, you realize there's other people doing it too. So,
yeah, it's definitely a different dynamic out there. And again, your first year out there, so hopefully everything went well for you with the Christmas holiday. But I want to touch on Week 17 here in the NFL. I'm sure you heard the tail end of that segment there with Brian. What are your thoughts on this week in the NFL? I mean, do you feel like you've got some good value? Do you look to pick off some things, or do you take it real easy and tread lightly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you got to pick your spots. I mean, there are certain, elements. And I mean, and the fact that in the NFL this week, you've only got two teams in the playoffs that can really rest guys and not have it affect them in terms of seeding, which would be Dallas and also New Orleans. So everybody else kind of has to play. I mean, because their seeding's not determined, or division has not been determined, and whatnot. So, I mean, especially in the AFC where there's no seeds that are really settled. So, you know, you're getting a lot more of these teams that are going to be playing. And then you have obviously several games on the board where you have two teams matching up that are not going to make the playoffs. So, I mean, you know, those are a little bit trickier spots. But, I mean, we saw last week with so many road teams covering that, you know, a lot of these guys necessarily aren't phoning or mailing in an effort. I mean, that they're still playing. I mean, you saw Jacksonville with nothing to play for go in and beat Miami last week, and you know that's a perfect example. So you know, just because some teams are out of the playoffs doesn't mean they're necessarily going to quit.
Well, and I think it's one of those things in the NFL too. I mean, obviously we know that tanking happens a ton in the NBA. I think to a lesser extent it happens a little bit in the NHL, but the NBA definitely notorious for it. It's easier to tank and sort of not want to show up when you're playing 3 or 4 games a week. When you're playing 1 game a week, yeah, it's a little bit different. So I don't really think that tanking happens in the NFL as much as, you know, some people want to pretend it does. I mean, I think it's just one of those things where, you know, guys are playing for contracts. And even this week, you know, you've got a team like Dallas who's going to play virtually nobody, and I wouldn't play anybody on either side of the ball. You still have backups that want to make an impression, want to get playing time or get a contract somewhere else. You know, how many times, think about the Saints, for example, with A.J. Klein. You know, he's playing basically behind Luke Kuechly, gets chances because of all Kuechly's injuries. All of a sudden, he gets a huge contract from New Orleans in free agency. You know, there are backup players that are going to do that here this offseason. They're going to show up this week, and so are the guys around them. I think this is a week where you don't want to take anything for granted.
No, not at all. I mean, you know, I just don't see. I mean, we're probably going to see a blowout in some game, and we don't know which one it'll be. But I mean, I don't think guys are necessarily just gonna want to go mail it in. And I mean, that's hard to do in something like the NFL anyway, just from an individual player standpoint. Not only with contracts and playing for your job, either with your current team or perhaps for another team. But, I mean, you can't really go out there and necessarily half-ass it because, you know, this is still, even with the rules in terms of, you know, trying to legislate the physicality of the game, you know, if you're not physical out there and you're going half speed and half-ass, that's how you get hurt. And, you know, so it's really hard to say, you know, okay, well, this team is not going to the playoffs, so, you know, they're just not going to care.
I think something that's really interesting this week, I want to get your thoughts on this. The Jets are probably going to fire Todd Bowles. I mean, I think that at this point, they probably need to clean house with a lot of the executives that are there, and then also the coaching staff, and sort of build around Sam Darnold. Green Bay, interim head coach Joe Philbin, he's not getting that job. Tampa Bay, Dirk Cotter and his staff, they're all gone. Cincinnati, I think it's probably past time to move on from Marvin Lewis. We've seen some rumors that Arizona may move on from Steve Wilkes after just 1 year. A lot of head coaching jobs in limbo. Denver's going to fire Vance Joseph, either in limbo or decided, to the point where the players really lean on the wall here. So what do you think about those teams? Is it just you got to evaluate each one individually, or do you feel like there's kind of a blanket statement we can throw over all of them?
Well, I think if you look, I don't think any of those teams you mentioned where it's going to be, players, necessarily playing for those those coaches' jobs or that coach to stay. I mean, if they're going to play, they're going to play for themselves individually and play for pride and perhaps play for their teammates. But, a couple of the ones you mentioned, like I don't see any way Denver brings Vance Joseph back. But, that's still a team that you can't just dismiss the Chargers have obviously so much more to play for, and they're so much better on the road. 7-1 straight up, 6-2, I think they're 7-1 actually, ATS on the road. Much better on the road than they are at that kind of makeshift home stadium they've been playing in. But, it's still Denver, even being at 6-9, that's still not an easy place to win on the road with the altitude and whatnot. And the fact that the line is below 7, with all with everything to play for the Chargers, it's like, do you really want to necessarily jump in on the Chargers and think that that's just easy money? And, books aren't into giving out easy money in Week 17, I can tell you that. So, you can't just take necessarily everything at face value. Atlanta, Tampa Bay is obviously a coin flip. Both of them, Atlanta got a road win last week in Carolina, but against a second and third team quarterback. Tampa Bay actually did put an effort out in Dallas, ended up getting a backdoor cover, depending on your number, but, they didn't go out there and just necessarily go through the motions, and I wouldn't anticipate it here in Week 17 either.
It's hard because I think, I think the over is the right play in Atlanta and Tampa Bay, and we're seeing that total go from 49.5 to 52 because when there's nothing to play for, the playbook gets loosened up a little bit. The offenses look to put up numbers. So I think, like we saw in that Green Bay Jets game last week where that thing absolutely flew over the total, I think that's the right play in a lot of these games of teams that, aren't really going anywhere. But there are a lot of fringy playoff scenarios in a lot of these different games here. And I think one thing, too, about this week is that, you look at the Philadelphia and Washington game, for example, despite Philadelphia's best effort team to not, look at the scoreboard and try to figure out, what other contenders are doing for that wild spot, someone's going to tell them. That information is going to come out, what Minnesota is doing in their game against the Bears. So, for Philadelphia here, you may really like them. You may think, okay, Super Bowl champs, Nick Foles, they're going to figure this thing out. They're going to win this game running away. But if they get wind that Minnesota is, beating up on Chicago, all of a sudden, they may kind of change their personality in that game. So that's something about, how all these games match up from a starting time standpoint where live betting could be a very, very profitable thing on Sunday.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that they try to, put these games kind of at the same time, to where they're not, I like the fact that they're putting Oakland, Kansas City, and the Chargers, Denver, both in that 125 window. So it's not like, okay, City wins easily in the first game, and now the Chargers know that they can't do anything, so they're just going to sit guys out if they're in the late afternoon game. So I actually like what they did with the scheduling dynamic here. And, I think, that makes for better competition. Obviously, the league wants these games to matter. That's why all of them are interdivision games. So I mean, they want a good product in week 17, and not necessarily a ton of meaningless games. I mean, I think you have maybe at least 4 or 5 or close to that where both teams are really essentially not going to the playoffs, but they want competitive balance. So I mean, I could certainly understand why they do that.
Well, and there's one spot I think is particularly interesting. It's Jacksonville and Houston. Houston down from 9 into the 7.5 range here. I understand that coaches, they'll probably say that they never look at betting spreads or anything like that. And you don't necessarily have to look at the betting spread if you're Houston, to see what's going on here for New England this week. But if I'm Bill O'Brien, I kind of look at this spot and say, you know what? I'm not going to play Deshaun Watson. I'm not going to play Nook Hopkins. I'm not going to play, J.J. Watt and Jadeveon Clowney, because what are the actual chances that New England loses to the Jets? Very, very slim. So I think, I'd be somebody who would go out there and grab Jacksonville plus 7.5 as just a numbers grab, expecting Houston to make some, decisions that are going to affect this line later in the week. Those are things I think that are worthwhile and probably plus EV in the long run.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think you look at Jacksonville. I mean, if they're playing for pride, I mean, they got essentially dominated by Houston, and that's kind of, I think, what turned Houston's season around. Even though they were 3-3, and we talked about it in previous segments that they could have barely easily been 0-6, and it wasn't until they went to Jacksonville and won, I think it was 20-7, but pretty much dominated them, that, it was like, okay, maybe Houston has something here. And then that, I think, spurred them on to bigger and better things, but I do think Jacksonville, I mean, they look at okay, we've been arguably the most disappointing team in the league. Some would say the Steelers, but being in the AFC Championship game and sitting at a 5-10 record, sometimes teams do want to extend their season out on a high note and at least have a little bit of optimism or a little bit of good feeling when there haven't been as much good feelings throughout the season. At least go into the off season with that. And, when Blake Bortles lost that job, people could say what they want about him. But, I mean, when he kind of came into the game, even though he didn't have a lot of series and didn't put up a lot of big numbers, I think it kind of spurred them last week in Miami. And maybe, the fact that the guy's been the starter for a while, I don't think he's not disliked by his teammates. I mean, so I think that, that might have spurred them on a little bit. Little things like that, I think, can really spur a team, little motivational things that maybe you don't see. So, I mean, I agree with this line move on Jacksonville, and that's a play I liked early in the week.
Let me correct myself here, because for Houston, they would be a wild card team if they lose that game to Jacksonville. So I guess they do have more to play for than I originally thought, and why all these playoff scenarios are very important. If they lose that game, the winner of the Indy-Tennessee game wins the AFC South. So my apologies there for that. But there are these spots that do come up. There aren't as many of them here this year, but I do still think from a live betting standpoint, there are some of those that are in play. Maybe not necessarily the Jacksonville-Houston game, so I do apologize for misspeaking there. But even you'll get a game like Miami and Buffalo, for example. I think everybody's going to assume Miami goes up there with no desire to play. It's cold and dreary and gray in Buffalo at this time of the year. Game means nothing for them. You would think it'd be a pretty one-sided line movement there, but yet we're only up to 3.5. And I think that kind of speaks to this element of, they're all professional football players, that Miami appears to have no reason whatsoever to want to go up there and play. And this line opened 3, it's 3.5, and it's not, a runaway number. So still, don't take anything for granted this week is again, what the primary point is of this discussion.
Yeah, and I mean, I would look at that particular game and look at Buffalo as a side thinking, they did play at Miami just a couple weeks ago and outgained them 415 to 175, and still managed to lose the game in Miami. So, I mean, you could certainly see maybe there could be a little bit of motivation there. And plus, they've had kind of a tough season. And, this is a chance, but they've continued to play hard every week. I mean, they knew that they were going to be bad. And, they started out bad from the get-go and, weren't able to recover but play hard every week. How does Miami get over the fact that they haven't been in the playoffs in, I think I read it was 15 of the last 17 years or something like that, and this is their, I believe it was their 9th season in a row where they're either 500 or worse. So, does that kind of fester with the team? So I mean, that was a reason for me leaning with Bills, and the fact that they're a solid 3.5 instead of being 3. Maybe that's the odds maker telling you that he/she leans with Buffalo a little bit here. But I mean, those are really tough calls. And I think, this obviously isn't a week where you want to, even if you're doing it anyway, where you really want to, bet the board in the NFL.
All right, I want to transition over to the NBA for the last few minutes of the segment here because a lot of people say that in the NBA, the season begins on Christmas. You've got 5 games, generally most of them featuring premier teams, and it's sort of that wake-up call into the season. At least that's kind of the theory that some people work with here in basketball. What do you think? I mean, are you going to come out of the break, not really out of the break, but out of the holiday, ready to play those top contenders thinking that, all of a sudden they flip the switch?
Perhaps, and I think you also got to look at the teams that had Haitians that, are around 500 or maybe plus or minus 2 games over 500. Somebody like New Orleans or somebody like Utah or, even Houston, there's only 3 games over 500, and really kind of figuring out over the next week which way these teams are going to go. Because you've had some teams that I think have greatly surpassed expectations, like Sacramento. I mean, you wouldn't have thought they'd be 18 and 15, at Christmas. But they are because, and we've had this discussion before where it's like, okay, it usually takes 25 or so games to kind of really see where you are. Because some team will start out real hot and then all of a sudden they'll come back to earth, or a team will start out 2-8, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, they're better than that. And then they kind of, get back to normalcy. But, I think we know who, the few really bad teams are in the NBA. I think we know that Chicago's bad. I think we know that the Knicks are bad and that Phoenix is bad. That doesn't mean they might not have spots. Most of the teams in the NBA right now are kind of, either middling teams or good teams. There's very few what I would consider really bad teams right now. So, things I think are gonna kind of keep holding the form at least, from what I see.
Well, and of course now too, we start to get into the point where you get a lot of trade rumors, you get a lot of discussion of transactions, things of that sort. So, some of these teams that aren't really going anywhere. You take a team like Washington, for example, they probably need a shakeup, and maybe that includes trading John Wall away. So that's also a consideration now at this point, too. The holidays are gone. We're 2 months away from the All-Star break or so, I think. The trade buzz really starts up now, and that's something that can affect some of these teams, too.
Yeah, I think so. And, I think you're going to see, a couple of teams maybe if they're close, thinking maybe they can try to make a move to kind of cement themselves as a title contender. Because, there's really only, obviously, in the NBA, a few legitimate contenders. In the East, clearly Toronto, Philadelphia, I think, then certainly Milwaukee, Indiana. Those are really, to me, the 5 teams in the East. In the West, you have Golden State. You have, maybe the Lakers think that they're there. I don't, even though they were impressive last night, I don't know if they're there in terms of title contention. I mean, they could be, but I mean, you're seeing some of these teams, Denver or, Houston, I think, thinks that they're right there, even though their record doesn't indicate it. But I mean, somebody's probably going to try to make a big move to, really say, okay, we're going to go for it. And then you have some teams that have good records that I think have, maybe they're going to say, let's see how this plays out with our young core, like a Sacramento, or like, maybe the Clippers or somebody like that, where it's like, okay, we're just going to stay the course and see how we end up. We don't think we're necessarily a contender. We think we're playoff teams, but maybe they don't make too many drastic moves and just kind of look at what they have. Also include Oklahoma City, I guess, in that Western contention as well. But some of these teams, I think, in the middle or maybe toward the back end, 5 through 8, I think are kind of maybe going to stay the course, especially if they're a young team, and just see where it ends up.
Last thing I want to ask you about here, Wes, these kind of become the dog days of winter now. You're about 30 games into the season, so you're either in contention or you're not, or, you're kind of seeing what flaws you have as a team. Obviously, scheduling spots are a big deal at this time of the year. Bad weather can impact travel, stuff like that. So do you find that, maybe you're a little bit more active in the NBA market over the next, 4 to 6 weeks?
Maybe. I mean, I think, for me personally this year, I'm, a little bit up. I'm not, doing great in the NBA. But, I mean, NBA has kind of been back and forth. It's the toughest sport for me personally to handicap. Now, some people listen to this as like it's easy because they win. But, I mean, it is a little bit tough for me because not only, would you have teams that rest guys different nights and kind of seeing where they are, and especially with these being the dog days of winter, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to get more active or kind of, keep kind of the same with what I'm doing. Clearly, I think after the All-Star break, as you get into the spring, that's when I think you have to be a little more careful and maybe wait for the playoffs, as you get into like March and early, mid, late March. That's when you have some of these teams that are totally out of it. Maybe I don't know whether they're tanking or whether they're trying new lineups or trying to get certain guys more minutes to get a look and see what they have in terms of an individual player standpoint. But, I don't think I'm going to play any more or maybe any less over this next month or two.
Always good to get the insights of Wes Reynolds here on Bang the Book Radio. You can follow him on Twitter at Wes Reynolds and the number 1. Wes, appreciate the time, sir. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll talk to you again next week.
All right, Adam. Thanks a lot. Happy New Year, everyone.